historians restored. This 1872 portrait, what they found on the servant's wrist, was heartbreaking. Dr. Angela Morrison held the glass plate negative up to the light. Squinting through her magnifying loupe, the image captured 152 years ago. The plate had arrived at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in a wooden crate packed with straw, part of an estate donation from a family in rural Georgia. Someone's great-great-grandparents cleaning out an attic had found boxes of old photographs and decided the museum might want them. Most donations like this yielded little of historical significance. Family portraits, landscapes, the occasional interesting architectural detail. But this plate negative, dated 1872 on its paper sleeve, had caught Angela's attention immediately. The image showed a well-dressed couple posed in front of a large plantation house, the kind of formal portrait wealthy Southern families commissioned to document their prosperity and status, but it was what appeared in the background that made Angela's pulse quicken. Behind the posed couple, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, were figures working in what appeared to be a field or work area. People bent over tasks, carrying loads, moving through the frame during the long exposure time required for 19th century photography. "Marcus," Angela called to her colleague across the conservation laboratory. "Come look at this." Marcus Chen set down the daguerreotype he'd been examining and crossed to Angela's workstation. She positioned the glass plate on her light table, adjusting the illumination so the image showed clearly. 1872, she said. "Georgia, 7 years after abolition." Marcus leaned over the plate, studying it carefully. The couple in the foreground was crisp and clear. A man in his 50s wearing a dark suit and hat, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a woman seated beside him in an elaborate Victorian dress. They stared at the camera with the stern expressions typical of the era, projecting authority and respectability. But in the background, Marcus could see what had caught Angela's attention. 4, maybe 5 people working. The long exposure had blurred their movements slightly, making them appear almost ghost-like, but they were definitely there. "Sharecroppers," Marcus said quietly. "Or people who'd been enslaved on this property just 7 years earlier," Angela added. "The Reconstruction era. Technically free, but trapped in debt peonage, working the same land for the same families." She adjusted the magnification on her loupe. "I want to restore this plate. Digitize it at the highest resolution we can manage. I want to see these people in the background clearly." "The donors probably sent this because of the couple in front," Marcus observed. "Classic, wealthy Southern family portrait. They might not even have noticed the workers in the background." "Exactly," Angela said. "These people have been standing in the background of this photograph for a century and a half, barely visible, treated as part of the landscape. I want to bring them into focus. I want to see their faces." Marcus knew that tone. Angela had found something that mattered to her, and she wouldn't rest until she had extracted every bit of information the photograph could yield. "How long will the restoration take?" "However long it needs," Angela said, already preparing her documentation camera. "These people deserve to be seen, clearly, finally." She began the painstaking process that evening, working late after the rest of the staff had gone home. Glass plate negatives were fragile, prone to cracking and deterioration. This one had survived remarkably well, protected in its paper sleeve inside a wooden box in someone's attic, but time had still taken its toll. There were spots of silvering degradation, areas where the emulsion had separated slightly from the glass, fine scratches from decades of careful but imperfect storage. Angela documented every millimeter of the plate, photographing it from multiple angles under different lighting conditions. She measured the dimensions, noted the type of emulsion, identified the likely photographic process used. Then she began the digital scanning process, using the museum's highest resolution equipment to capture every detail the plate contained. As the first high-resolution scan appeared on her monitor, Angela leaned forward, her heart beating faster. The couple in the foreground appeared with startling clarity. She could see the weave of the man's suit fabric, the intricate lacework on the woman's collar, even the chain of the man's pocket watch. And in the background, still blurred but now much more visible, were the workers. Angela zoomed in on one figure. A man, she thought, bent over what might be a bale of cotton or tobacco. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. His back was curved with effort, and on his exposed forearm, Angela increased the magnification, her breath catching. There was something there, a mark, a scar, but the image was still too degraded, too damaged to see clearly. She would need to restore the plate, remove the deterioration, enhance the digital image. It would take weeks. But Angela was certain now. This photograph held a story, and she was going to make sure it was finally told. The restoration work consumed Angela's days and stretched into her evenings. She worked methodically, addressing the physical deterioration of the glass plate first. Using specialized cleaning solutions and tools, finer than surgical instruments, she removed decades of accumulated grime and oxidation. Each section of the plate required careful attention. Too much pressure could crack the fragile glass. Too aggressive cleaning could damage the delicate emulsion that held the photographic image. After 2 weeks of physical restoration, Angela moved to digital enhancement. She imported the high-resolution scans into her computer and began the painstaking process of removing artifacts, correcting exposure inconsistencies, and sharpening details that had been obscured by time and deterioration. The couple in the foreground emerged with remarkable clarity. Angela could now read the expression in the man's eyes. Pride, certainly, and something harder. Entitlement, defiance, perhaps, in the face of the changes the post-war South was experiencing. The woman beside him looked more resigned, her face showing the lines of someone who'd lived through war and its aftermath. But it was the background that held Angela's focus. As she enhanced the image, the workers became more distinct. She could count 5 people now, 3 men, 1 woman, and what appeared to be a child, perhaps 10 years old. They were spread across what was clearly a work area behind the main house, some carrying loads, others bent over tasks she couldn't quite identify even with enhancement. Marcus stopped by her workstation each day to check her progress. "You're obsessed with this one," he observed on a Thursday afternoon, setting down his usual offering of coffee. "Look at them," Angela said, gesturing to her screen. They were working while this wealthy couple posed for their portrait. The photographer captured both realities at once, the leisure class displaying their prosperity and the people whose labor made that prosperity possible. "It's right there in the same frame." She zoomed in on one of the male figures in the background. "This man here, I've been working on enhancing his image specifically. Look at his posture, the way his back curves, the tension in his shoulders. That's exhaustion, chronic, bone-deep exhaustion." She adjusted the contrast. "And his clothes. They're not rags, but they're worn, patched. These people were being worked to death, just like during slavery, but now it was called sharecropping instead." "Have you enhanced the detail enough to see their faces?" Marcus asked. "Getting there," Angela said. "The motion blur is challenging. They were moving during the exposure, so there's inherent softness. But I think I can get enough detail to see features, maybe even expressions." She paused, her cursor hovering over a section of the image. "And there's something else. Look at this." She zoomed in on the man she'd been focusing on, the one whose posture showed such clear exhaustion. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, exposing his forearms. And on his left wrist, even with the motion blur and distance from the camera, there was a visible mark. "Is that a scar?" Marcus asked, leaning closer to the monitor. "I think so, but I need to enhance it more to be sure." Angela made a note in her restoration log. "I'm going to focus on this area specifically. Maximum enhancement, edge detection algorithms, pattern recognition, everything we've got." Over the next 3 days, Angela worked almost exclusively on that one small section of the photograph. The man's wrist, exposed to the camera for perhaps 20 seconds in 1872, now occupied her entire screen. She applied enhancement after enhancement, each one revealing a little more detail. And slowly, an image emerged that made Angela's blood run cold. The mark on the man's wrist wasn't a simple scar. It was deliberately shaped, patterned. Letters. Initials burned into skin with a branding iron, creating a keloid scar that stood out even in the blurred, distant background of a century-and-a-half-old photograph. "Oh, God," Angela whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Marcus, working at his own station, heard the change in her voice and came immediately. "What is it?" Angela pointed to her screen with a shaking hand. "It's a brand. He was branded. Like cattle, like property." She increased the magnification even further, applying every enhancement tool she had. "And Marcus, I think I can read what it says." The letters were rough, distorted by the scarring and the limitations of the photographic technology, but with enhancement they became legible. 2 initials, burned into human flesh. R.H. Angela sat back from her monitor, feeling sick. "R.H., she said quietly. "We need to find out who this family was. We need to know if those initials match." Dr. Raymond Foster arrived from Atlanta 3 days later, his briefcase bulging with documents pulled from Georgia archives. Angela had sent him the enhanced images, along with what little provenance information they had. The photograph came from an estate in rural Georgia, Sumter County specifically, dated 1872. Raymond had immediately begun searching county records, census data, and plantation documentation. Now he spread his findings across the conference table in Angela's laboratory, organizing them chronologically. The Hartwell family, he announced, Robert and Catherine Hartwell, owned a plantation called Riverbend, approximately 2,000 acres along the Flint River, cotton and tobacco, primarily. Angela felt her stomach clench. "Robert Hartwell. R.H. Yes," Raymond confirmed. "I pulled the census records. In 1860, Robert Hartwell reported owning 137 enslaved people. That made him one of the larger slaveholders in the county. He laid out a photocopied page from an old ledger. This is the plantation record book from 1858 to 1865. Hartwell kept meticulous records, purchases, sales, births, deaths, and punishments." Marcus leaned over the ledger, reading the entries with growing horror. Each enslaved person was listed with a name, estimated age, skills, and monetary value. Some entries included notes. "Good worker, needs minimal supervision, rebellious, requires discipline, suitable for breeding." "It's nauseating," Marcus said. "It gets worse," Raymond said grimly. He pulled out another document, this one a letter written in flowing script. "This is correspondence between Robert Hartwell and his brother in South Carolina, dated January 1862. Listen to this." I have implemented a new system for maintaining discipline among my Negroes. Those who demonstrate rebellious tendencies or attempt to escape receive a permanent mark of ownership. Dr. Matthews has advised me on the proper temperature for the branding iron to ensure the mark remains visible without causing death or permanent incapacity. Several of my field hands now bear my initials, and the effect has been salutary. The others understand completely that they are my property and will remain so regardless of what northern agitators claim. Angela felt rage building in her chest. He branded them, systematically, as a terror tactic, and documented it proudly, Raymond added, because in 1862, in the Confederacy, this was considered acceptable plantation management. He wasn't hiding it, he was recommending the practice to his brother. Raymond pulled out more documents, building a picture of Robert Hartwell's life and operations. He'd been born in 1822 to an established planting family, inherited Riverbend when his father died in 1855, and immediately expanded operations. He'd served briefly in the Confederate Army, but was allowed to return home to manage his plantation, considered too valuable to the war effort to remain in uniform. After the war, he'd transitioned to sharecropping, keeping many of the same people working his land under new legal arrangements that were barely distinguishable from slavery. The 1870 census lists 43 African Americans living on or near the Hartwell property, Raymond said. They're listed as laborers or farmhands rather than enslaved people, but the census taker noted that most were in debt to Hartwell for supplies, tools, and lodging. Classic debt peonage. They couldn't leave because they legally owed him money, and the debt was structured so it could never be repaid. So the people in the background of this photograph, Angela said slowly, were likely people he'd enslaved before the war and was now exploiting under a different legal framework. Almost certainly, Raymond confirmed, and at least one of them bears his initials branded into their skin, a mark that would have been illegal to create after 1865, but was perfectly legal when it was done during slavery. Angela looked at the enhanced image on her laptop screen, at the man working with his sleeves rolled up, the brand clearly visible on his wrist. We need to find out who he was. We need to give him a name. Raymond nodded. I'll keep digging. If Hartwell branded him, there should be a record somewhere. These enslavers documented everything. Raymond spent 2 weeks in the Georgia archives, working through boxes of documents that had been donated over the years by the Hartwell family descendants. Most families didn't preserve their slavery-era records. They destroyed them out of shame or lost them through neglect. But the Hartwells had been different, apparently proud enough of their history that subsequent generations had carefully stored these documents, eventually donating them to the state archives as historical material. The plantation ledgers were the most revealing. Robert Hartwell had recorded every enslaved person he owned with bureaucratic precision. Each entry included not just names and values, but detailed physical descriptions and disciplinary notations. Raymond worked through the pages methodically, looking for mentions of branding. He found the first reference on a page dated March 1862. Samuel, age approximately 32, field hand, attempted escape January 1862, captured after 3 days. Disciplinary action. Branding with ownership. Mark RH on left wrist. Subject survived procedure without complications. To be monitored for infection. Expected to return to full work capacity within 2 weeks. Raymond felt sick reading it, but he continued. There were more entries. Thomas, branded in April 1862 after being caught with abolitionist literature. Moses, branded in June 1862 after striking an overseer who'd whipped his wife. Jacob, branded in August 1862 for teaching other enslaved people to read. By the end of 1862, Hartwell's ledger showed 12 people bearing his brand, but it was an entry from November 1862 that made Raymond stop and read 3 times. Joshua, age approximately 28, skilled carpenter and blacksmith, discovered attempting to forge travel passes for other Negroes. Discipline required to make example. Branding with ownership, Mark R.H. On left wrist, conducted in presence of other slaves to demonstrate consequences of subversion. Subject showed no remorse and required additional physical discipline. Utility preserved, but rebellious spirit noted for continued monitoring. Raymond pulled up the enhanced photograph on his laptop and studied the man in the background, the one with the visible brand. He was bent over work, but his build suggested strength despite the exhausted posture. Could this be Joshua? A carpenter and blacksmith would have the kind of physical development visible even in this distant, blurred image. He called Angela immediately. I think I found him. Joshua, carpenter and blacksmith, branded in November 1862 for forging travel passes. He was helping other people try to escape. Joshua, Angela repeated softly. After 152 years, we have a name. There's more, Raymond said. The ledger continues through 1865. Joshua appears in work assignments throughout, building repairs, tool manufacturing, blacksmith work. He was valuable to Hartwell because of his skills. And then, Raymond found the page. Here, April 1865, right after Lee's surrender. All Negroes informed of emancipation order. Many departed immediately. Some remained, uncertain of options. Joshua, among those who stayed, likely due to lack of alternatives, have offered sharecropping arrangement. He stayed, Marcus said. He was listening on speakerphone in Angela's laboratory. After everything, he stayed. Because where could he go? Angela asked bitterly. He was freed into a destroyed economy with no resources, no protection, and carrying a brand that marked him permanently as having been property. The sharecropping arrangement was probably his only option for survival. Raymond continued reading from the post-war records. The ledgers shifted in 1866 from recording enslaved people to recording sharecropping contracts. Joshua appeared in these records, assigned a small plot of land to work in exchange for a share of the crop, but the terms were exploitative. He had to purchase seeds, tools, and supplies from Hartwell at inflated prices, and the debt accumulated faster than his share of the harvest could pay it off. By 1872, Raymond said, when this photograph was taken, Joshua had been free for 7 years but owed Hartwell over $300, an impossible sum. He was trapped. And Hartwell posed for this photograph, Angela said, looking at Robert Hartwell's proud stance in the image, with Joshua working in the background, still carrying the brand mark that declared him property. 7 years after abolition, and nothing had really changed. With Joshua's name in hand, Raymond expanded his search. He combed through records from the Reconstruction era and beyond, looking for any mention of Joshua connected to Sumter County, Georgia, or the Hartwell plantation. The work was frustrating. Record-keeping for African Americans during this period was sparse and inconsistent, but Raymond was persistent, and slowly, fragments of Joshua's life emerged. The Freedmen's Bureau records provided the first breakthrough. In 1868, a complaint was filed with the local bureau office by Joshua, Negro freedman, formerly enslaved by R. Hartwell. The complaint alleged that Hartwell was charging extortionate prices for supplies and manipulating the accounting to ensure Joshua's debt never decreased, despite years of labor. Raymond read the bureau agent's response aloud to Angela over the phone. Investigated complaint by Joshua regarding contractual terms with R. Hartwell found that, while prices charged are higher than market rates, they are not explicitly illegal under current regulation. Joshua's debt is documented and appears accurate according to Hartwell's books. No legal grounds for intervention. Advise Joshua to work harder to pay off obligation or seek alternative employment, though no local landowners are willing to hire Negroes currently indebted to other parties. They documented his complaint and then did nothing, Angela said, her voice tight with anger. The Freedmen's Bureau was understaffed and underfunded, Raymond said, and many agents were Southern whites who sympathized more with landowners than with formerly enslaved people. Joshua was trapped in a system designed to keep him trapped. But Joshua had persisted. Raymond found evidence of him in county records throughout the 1870s and 1880s. A marriage license from 1873, Joshua, no surname given, to Sarah Matthews. Birth records for 3 children, James in 1874, Elizabeth in 1876, Samuel in 1879. Tax records showing he somehow managed to purchase 2 acres of land in 1881, though the property remained mortgaged. He built a life, Marcus observed, reading over the documents Raymond had sent. Despite everything, the brand, the debt, the system designed to destroy him, he married, had children, bought land. Angela studied the enhanced photograph on her screen, looking at Joshua's bent posture as he worked in the background of Robert Hartwell's formal portrait. He survived, she said quietly. That's what survival looked like. Working yourself to exhaustion for the man who'd branded you like cattle, 7 years after the law said you were free. Raymond found Joshua's death record in the county archives. Joshua Freeman, he'd taken Freeman as a surname, Raymond noted with a mix of sadness and admiration, died February 1891, age approximately 56, cause of death listed as heart failure. He was buried in the African American section of the county cemetery, his grave marked only with a simple wooden cross that had long since rotted away. Freeman, Angela said when Raymond told her. He chose Freeman as his last name because he refused to take Hartwell's name, which many formerly enslaved people did, Raymond explained. He claimed his identity completely, even carrying that brand he insisted on naming himself. But the most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Raymond was searching through digitized newspapers from the Reconstruction era when he found a brief article in an African American newspaper called the Colored Tribune, published in Atlanta. The article, dated 1889, was titled, "Former Slaves Share Testimony of Bondage." Raymond read it with growing excitement. At a gathering of the Colored Baptist Church in Americus, several formerly enslaved persons shared their experiences of bondage and freedom. Among them was Joshua Freeman, age 55, of Sumter County, who bore visible scars of his enslavement. Mr. Freeman displayed the brand mark upon his wrist, testimony to the cruelty he endured. "They marked me like cattle," he told the assembled crowd. "But they could not mark my soul. I am a free man now, though I carry their mark until I die. Let this scar be a reminder of what was done, and what must never be done again." His testimony moved many to tears. Angela wept when Raymond read her the article. Joshua had not only survived, he had testified. He had shown his brand to a crowd and claimed his story. He had refused to let the mark define him while simultaneously refusing to let the world forget what had been done to him. "We have to tell his story," Angela said. "Completely. The brand, the photograph, the survival, the testimony, all of it." "I agree," Raymond said. But there's one more thing we need to do. We need to find out if Joshua has descendants. We need to know if his family is still here. Or finding Joshua's descendants proved to be a challenge that tested every genealogical skill Raymond possessed. The trail began with Joshua's children, documented in Sumter County birth records: James, Elizabeth, and Samuel. From there, Raymond had to trace forward through generations using marriage records, census data, death certificates, and any other documentation he could find. The work was complicated by the Great Migration, when millions of African Americans left the South between 1910 and 1970, seeking opportunity and escape from Jim Crow oppression. Joshua's children and grandchildren had scattered, some staying in Georgia, others moving to Atlanta, Detroit, Chicago, New York. The family tree branched and spread, and records became harder to track. Angela, assisted by posting inquiries on genealogy websites and contacting African American historical societies in Georgia and across the South. Marcus reached out to churches in Sumter County, knowing that black churches often maintained better family records than official government sources. After 6 weeks of intensive searching, Raymond found a crucial lead. A woman named Patricia Freeman had posted on a genealogy forum about her family history, mentioning an ancestor named Joshua who'd been enslaved in Sumter County. Raymond contacted her immediately. Patricia Freeman was 72 years old, living in Atlanta, retired from a career as a social worker. When Raymond called and explained what they'd found, her voice broke. "My grandfather used to tell us stories about his grandfather Joshua. He said Joshua had been branded during slavery and carried the mark his whole life. We thought they were just family stories. We never had proof." Raymond arranged to meet Patricia in Atlanta. He brought copies of all the documents he'd found: the plantation ledgers, the Freedmen's Bureau complaint, the newspaper article, and most importantly, the enhanced photograph showing Joshua working in the background, his branded wrist visible. Patricia wept when she saw the photograph. "That's him," she whispered, touching the screen of Raymond's laptop. "That's my great-great-great-grandfather, working for the man who branded him even after freedom came." She looked up at Raymond, tears streaming down her face. "You found him. After all these years, you found him." She showed Raymond the family documents she'd preserved: a Bible with birth and death dates recorded in fading ink, photographs from the early 1900s showing Joshua's children and grandchildren, and a small metal box that had belonged to her grandfather. Inside the box was a folded piece of paper, brown with age, covered in careful handwriting. "My grandfather said this was written by Joshua in 1890, a year before he died," Patricia explained. "He dictated it to the teacher at the colored school, and she wrote it down for him. It's his testimony." Raymond unfolded the paper with trembling hands and read, "I, Joshua Freeman, formerly enslaved by Robert Hartwell of Sumter County, Georgia, set down this testimony for my children and their children. I was born into bondage approximately 1834. I learned the trades of carpenter and blacksmith. In November 1862, I was branded with my enslaver's initials for helping others seek freedom. I bear this mark still. When freedom came in 1865, I was free in name but remained bound by debt and circumstance. I worked the same land for the same man for years after. But I survived. I married. I raised children who were born free. I bought land with my own labor. I stood in church and showed my brand and told my story so others would remember. This mark on my wrist is a scar of what was done to me. But my life is a testimony to what they could not do. They could not break me. They could not silence me. They could not make me forget I was a man. I die soon, I think. My body is worn from a lifetime of labor. But I die free. And my children are free. And their children will be free. Remember this. Remember that we survived. Remember that we refused to be erased. Joshua Freeman, his mark, 1890. The room was silent except for the sound of Raymond and Patricia crying. After a long moment, Raymond spoke. "We're preparing an exhibition at the National Museum of African American History. Joshua's story will be told. The photograph, the documents, his testimony, everything. And we want you and your family to be part of it." Patricia nodded, unable to speak. Then she opened the metal box again and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small, roughly forged piece of metal. A brand with the letters RH raised on its surface. "Joshua kept this," she said quietly. "The brand they used on him. My grandfather said Joshua took it from Hartwell's blacksmith shop before he left the plantation. He kept it as evidence, as reminder, as testimony." She looked at Raymond. "I want this in the exhibition, too. I want people to see the actual tool they use to mark human beings as property." Raymond accepted the brand with reverence, understanding the weight of what Patricia was entrusting to him. This wasn't just a historical artifact. It was evidence of a crime, testimony to brutality, and proof of one man's refusal to let his story be forgotten. Angela spent 3 months designing the exhibition, working closely with museum curators, educators, and descendants of enslaved people to ensure the presentation honored Joshua's story while contextualizing it within the broader history of slavery, Reconstruction, and racial oppression. The exhibition would be called The Mark of Bondage, Joshua Freeman's Testimony. The centerpiece was the restored 1872 photograph, displayed at monumental size, 8 feet wide, dominating the main wall. But unlike a typical historical photograph exhibition, This one inverted the usual focus. Robert and Catherine Hartwell, posed so proudly in the foreground, were shown at actual size. But Joshua, working in the background, was enlarged dramatically, brought into sharp focus through digital enhancement, his face and branded wrist clearly visible. "We're reversing the photograph's original intent," Angela explained to the museum director. "The Hartwells wanted to be the focus, with the workers as background decoration. We're centering Joshua instead, making the invisible visible." Beside the photograph, displayed in a climate-controlled case, was the branding iron Patricia had provided. The sight of it made visitors stop in their tracks. The crude metal tool, the raised letters RH, the wooden handle worn smooth by use. A placard explained, "This branding iron was used to mark enslaved people as property on the Hartwell plantation. Joshua Freeman was branded with this tool in November 1862. The exhibition included all the documentation Raymond had found: plantation ledgers with Joshua's name, the Freedmen's Bureau complaint, marriage and birth records, the newspaper article about his testimony, and most powerfully, Joshua's own written statement from 1890. The handwritten testimony was displayed alongside a large print transcription, ensuring every visitor could read his words. Angela also included contemporary context. Information panels explained the sharecropping system, debt peonage, and how formerly enslaved people were trapped in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, even after legal emancipation. Statistics showed that in 1872, when the photograph was taken, most African Americans in the South owned no land, had no access to credit or education, and worked under contracts that kept them perpetually indebted. But the most emotionally powerful element was a video installation featuring Patricia Freeman and other descendants. Patricia spoke directly to camera about growing up hearing stories of Joshua, about what it meant to finally see his photograph and hold proof of his existence. Other descendants, discovered through Patricia's connections and Raymond's research, shared their family stories and reflected on carrying forward Joshua's legacy. "My great-great-great-grandfather refused to be erased," Patricia said in the video, tears in her eyes. "He carried that brand for 29 years after he was legally freed. 29 years of visible evidence of what had been done to him. But he didn't hide it. He showed it. He testified. He insisted the world see and remember. And now, more than a century after his death, we're still remembering. We're still testifying. That's what survival looks like. That's what resistance looks like." The exhibition also included a reflection space at the end, a quiet room with benches where visitors could sit and process what they'd seen. On one wall was a mirror, and above it, a quote from Joshua's testimony: "This mark on my wrist is a scar of what was done to me. But my life is a testimony to what they could not do." Angela stood in the empty exhibition space the night before it opened, looking at Joshua's enlarged face staring out from the photograph. Marcus found her there, standing in silence. "You did something extraordinary," Marcus said quietly. Angela shook her head. "Joshua did the extraordinary thing. He survived. He testified. He made sure his story wouldn't be forgotten. She paused, her voice breaking. "I just cleaned away the damage, so we could see what he'd been showing us all along." The exhibition opened on Juneteenth, the commemoration of June 19, 1865, when enslaved people in Texas finally learned of their emancipation. The timing was deliberate. Joshua's story was fundamentally about the gap between legal freedom and actual liberation, and Juneteenth embodied that complex reality. Patricia Freeman arrived with more than 30 family members, children, grandchildren, cousins, all descendants of Joshua. They gathered in front of the enormous photograph, seeing their ancestor's face clearly for the first time. Several wept openly. Others stood in awed silence. One of Patricia's grandchildren, a teenager named Marcus, no relation to Angela's colleague, stared at Joshua's image and said quietly, "He looks like my dad. Same eyes, same way of holding his shoulders." The museum had scheduled a formal opening ceremony. The director spoke about the importance of preserving difficult histories. Raymond presented his research findings. Angela explained the restoration process and the decision to center Joshua rather than the Hartwell family in the exhibition design. But the most powerful moment came when Patricia stepped to the microphone, accompanied by her entire family. She spoke with a strength that reminded everyone present of Joshua himself. "For generations, my family preserved Joshua's story through oral tradition," Patricia began. "We told our children about the man who was branded but never broken, the man who was freed but had to keep working for his enslaver, the man who testified about his bondage so others would remember. But we lived with the fear that comes from oral history, the fear that details would be lost, that eventually his story would fade into family legend, that people would stop believing it really happened." She gestured to the exhibition behind her. "Today, that fear ends. Today, Joshua's story is documented, proven, preserved. Anyone who doubts what slavery was, what it did to people, what it continued to do long after legal emancipation, they can stand in front of this photograph and see. They can read the plantation ledgers. They can see the branding iron. They can read Joshua's own words." Patricia's voice strengthened. "But this exhibition isn't just about the past. It's about now, because Joshua's descendants are still here. We're doctors, teachers, engineers, artists, social workers. We're raising children who know their history, who understand where they come from. Joshua wanted us to remember. He wanted us to testify. So that's what we're doing. She turned to face the photograph directly. Great-great-great-grandfather, we see you, we remember you, we testify for you. Your mark has become our strength. Your survival has become our inheritance. You refuse to be erased, and we carry that refusal forward. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, followed by the opening of the exhibition to the public. The response was overwhelming. Lines stretched around the block. Visitors moved through the space in hushed reverence, many openly weeping. Teachers brought school groups. Journalists wrote features. Social media exploded with images of the photograph and Joshua's testimony. But the most meaningful responses came from other descendants of enslaved people who saw their own family histories reflected in Joshua's story. Many contacted the museum to share their own family testimonies, their own preserved documents, their own evidence of survival and resistance. The exhibition became a catalyst for broader conversations about how slavery's legacy persisted long after abolition, and how African American families had preserved their histories despite systematic efforts to erase them. One visitor, an elderly black woman named Dorothy, stood in front of the photograph for nearly an hour. When a museum docent gently asked if she was all right, Dorothy said, "My grandfather was branded too, on his shoulder. He died when I was young, but I remember seeing the mark. I remember asking what it was, and my grandmother saying, 'That's what they did to us.' I never fully understood until now." She touched the display case containing the branding iron. "Thank you for showing this, for not hiding it, for making people see." The exhibition's impact extended far beyond the museum walls. Within weeks, news coverage had spread Joshua's story nationally and internationally. Scholars requested access to the documents for research. Documentary filmmakers approached Patricia about a longer-form project. Teachers incorporated the materials into curriculum about Reconstruction and its failures, but the most significant development came from Sumter County, Georgia, where Joshua had lived and worked. A coalition of African American community leaders, historians, and activists began pushing for recognition of the county's Reconstruction-era history, including the exploitative sharecropping system that had trapped people like Joshua. Raymond traveled to Sumter County to participate in a community forum about historical memory and racial justice. The event was held at the county courthouse, and more than 300 people attended, both black and white residents, descendant communities, historians, and local officials. The forum began with a presentation of Joshua's story, using materials from the museum exhibition. As the enlarged photograph appeared on screen, showing Joshua working in the background while Robert Hartwell posed proudly in the foreground, the room went silent. When the branding iron was shown, several people gasped. The discussion that followed was passionate and sometimes painful. Black residents spoke about growing up hearing family stories similar to Joshua's, stories of grandparents and great-grandparents who'd been enslaved, who'd been trapped in debt peonage after freedom, who'd carried the physical and psychological scars of bondage throughout their lives. "My great-grandfather worked as a sharecropper until he died in 1932, said one man, a retired teacher named William. He was born enslaved in 1863, freed as an infant, but spent 70 years working land he could never own, accumulating debt he could never pay. That's not freedom. That's slavery with a different name." White residents responded with mixed reactions. Some expressed genuine horror at the history being revealed, admitting they'd never learned these details in school. Others became defensive, arguing that not all landowners had been exploitative, that some had treated their workers fairly. Several pointed out that their own ancestors had struggled economically after the Civil War as well. But it was Patricia Freeman's presence at the forum that shifted the conversation. She stood and addressed the room directly. "I'm not here to debate whether some landowners were kinder than others," she said firmly. "I'm here to testify that my great-great-great-grandfather was branded like cattle, worked for decades under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, and died still carrying that mark. That's not a matter of opinion. That's documented fact." She continued, her voice steady but emotional. "And I'm here to ask this community, what are you going to do with this truth? Are you going to look away, make excuses, insist it wasn't that bad? Or are you going to acknowledge what happened here, honor the people who survived it, and commit to making sure their stories are told honestly?" The forum concluded with the formation of a working group to explore creating a county-wide historical marker program, documenting both slavery and Reconstruction-era racial oppression. The group would include descendant communities, historians, and local officials. Its goal was to ensure that the full, honest history of Sumter County was preserved and taught. Additionally, the county agreed to work with Patricia's family to identify and preserve the cemetery where Joshua was buried. The section of the cemetery where African Americans had been buried during and after Reconstruction had been neglected for decades, many graves unmarked or overgrown. Patricia's family, with support from the Historical Society, would fund a memorial marker for Joshua's grave, ensuring his resting place was honored. Back at the museum, Angela received a letter from a visitor that captured the exhibition's impact. "I'm a white woman from Georgia. I was taught in school that Reconstruction was a difficult time for everyone, that formerly enslaved people were freed and given opportunities they didn't know how to use. I was taught that sharecropping was an economic system that benefited both landowners and workers. Your exhibition shattered those lies. I saw the brand. I read the plantation ledgers. I looked at Joshua's exhausted posture in that photograph and understood, finally, that legal freedom meant nothing without economic freedom, without justice, without acknowledgement of what had been done. Thank you for making me see. Thank you for centering the truth. It was 6 months after the exhibition opened, Angela stood in the conservation laboratory where Joshua's story had first emerged from damaged glass and degraded silver. The original photograph, now properly preserved and protected, sat in its archival housing, but copies of the image had spread across the world. In textbooks, documentaries, news articles, social media posts, Joshua's face, once barely visible in the background of someone else's portrait, was now recognized by millions. Patricia Freeman had become a spokesperson for descendant communities, traveling to speak about family history preservation and the importance of centering enslaved people's perspectives in historical narratives. She'd written a memoir about discovering Joshua's photograph and what it meant to her family. The book included reproductions of all the documents Raymond had found, plus family photographs spanning 6 generations from Joshua to Patricia's own grandchildren. But Joshua refused to be invisible, Patricia wrote in the book's conclusion. He carried his brand openly, testified publicly, and insisted that his story be preserved. When I look at my grandchildren, I see his legacy, not the brand. We don't carry that mark physically, but we carry his refusal to be silenced. We carry his insistence on being seen, being remembered, being honored. That's what survival looks like across generations. The museum exhibition had been extended twice due to popular demand and was now scheduled to travel to other museums across the country. Each venue would include local historical context, connecting Joshua's story to regional histories of slavery, Reconstruction, and systemic racial oppression. But perhaps the most meaningful development came from an unexpected source. A descendant of Robert Hartwell, a great-great-great-grandson named David Hartwell, contacted the museum. He was a professor of ethics at a university in North Carolina, and he'd seen the exhibition during a visit to Washington. David requested a meeting with Angela, Raymond, and Patricia. When they met, he came prepared with his own family documents, letters, journals, photographs, including several more images of the Hartwell plantation that showed enslaved and formerly enslaved people working. I grew up hearing that my ancestors were genteel Southern planters who treated their slaves kindly, David said, his voice thick with emotion. The family history painted Robert Hartwell as a benevolent patriarch who helped his former slaves transition to freedom after the war. I believed it because I wanted to believe it. He looked at Patricia directly. Seeing Joshua's brand, reading the plantation ledgers, understanding what my ancestor actually did, it destroyed those comfortable lies. Robert Hartwell wasn't a benevolent patriarch. He was a man who branded human beings, who exploited them before and after legal emancipation, who documented his cruelty in careful ledgers as if it were normal business practice. David paused, gathering himself. I want to donate these family documents to the museum, all of them. I want the full truth preserved. And I want to publicly acknowledge what my ancestor did to your ancestor. He turned to Patricia. I can't undo it. I can't erase that brand or give back the decades of stolen labor. But I can refuse to perpetuate the lies. I can testify to the truth alongside you. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you for choosing truth over comfortable fiction, for refusing to protect your ancestors' reputation at the expense of my ancestors' dignity." David's documents became part of the traveling exhibition, providing additional context about how enslavers viewed their actions and justified their brutality to themselves and their descendants. His public statement about confronting his family's true history became a model for other descendants of enslavers, demonstrating how acknowledging difficult truths could be part of healing and justice. On the 1-year anniversary of the exhibition's opening, the museum held a special event. Patricia's family returned, now joined by dozens of other descendants of people who'd been enslaved on the Hartwell plantation. Connections forged through the publicity around Joshua's story. They gathered in front of the photograph, a living testament to survival and resilience. Angela stood at the back of the room, watching as Patricia's teenage grandson, Marcus, stood before his great-great-great-great-grandfather's image. Marcus was a high school senior, headed to college in the fall to study history. He stared at Joshua's face for a long time, then turned to address the crowd. When I was little, my grandmother told me stories about Joshua, about the brand, about the testimony, about refusing to be erased. But I didn't really understand until I saw this photograph, until I stood here and looked at him. Marcus's voice was strong, carrying Joshua's refusal to be silenced forward into a new generation. He's looking at us. Across 152 years, he's looking at us and saying, "Remember. Remember what was done. Remember who survived. Remember to testify." Marcus touched the display case protecting the photograph. "I'm going to remember. I'm going to study this history, teach this history, make sure this history isn't hidden or sanitized or forgotten, because that's what Joshua did. He testified, and we're still testifying." Angela felt tears streaming down her face. This was why she did this work. not just to restore old photographs, but to restore visibility, dignity, and voice to people who'd been intentionally obscured and silenced. Joshua had stood in the background of that photograph in 1872, barely visible, marked and exploited, working for the man who'd branded him. But he'd stared at the camera. He'd made sure he was in the frame. He'd waited a century and a half for someone to look closely enough to see him, and now millions had seen him. His story had been told. His testimony had been heard. His refusal to be erased had succeeded. That night, Angela returned one final time to look at the original glass plate negative, stored safely in the museum's climate-controlled archives. She held it up to the light, seeing the reversed image. The Hartwells dark where they should be light, Joshua light where he should be dark, the whole world inverted. "Thank you," she whispered to the image. "Thank you for staring at that camera. Thank you for making sure you were visible. Thank you for refusing to let them erase you." Joshua's eyes stared back across time, bearing witness, testifying, claiming his place in history. The photograph that was meant to celebrate the Hartwell family's prosperity had instead become Joshua Freeman's testimony, evidence of what was done to him and proof of what they could not do. They could not break him. They could not silence him. They could not make him invisible. And now, finally, permanently, the world would remember.